Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the University of the Witwatersrand's Fossil Hominid Vault here in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Lee Berger, a paleoanthropologist here at the university and an explorer at large for the National Geographic Society. This morning, when I opened up my email before coming into the Fossil Vault, I picked up some clickbait on my name, and that's not unusual if you're a public figure scientist. But this one was from a legitimate news source, Discover, and so I opened it, and there was a story about giants. Were there ever giants? And the answer is, according to this, of course, no. But in it, it took a tagline from me saying Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist, had once claimed that there were hominids that may have reached 7 foot tall and over 90 kilograms, and there was little evidence for that. Well, since it was questioning evidence that perhaps I had presented, I decided that since I was coming into the vault, I'd show you some of that evidence, and let's discuss what's behind this supposed controversy. Now, why first would other scientists, and Discover was taking this from other scientists, it just wasn't bad reporting, would they criticize me having said that there were very large individuals in the past that might have approached 7 foot? Well, this all comes from a paper that Steve Churchill, John Parkington, and myself wrote back several years ago about the Hutchie's pint tibia, which is a late Middle Pleistocene tibia that's very large. It comes from the Western Cape of South Africa, but also comes from an interview I did for the Naked Scientist, where I was showing them a fossil here in our vault many years ago that seemed to indicate that there were very, very large individuals at some time in the past, and we had sometimes sampled them. So I pulled that individual out. Let's look at the real evidence for that. Then let's look at the reason behind why that might be seen as controversial. This is the specimen. This is a femur. That's your thigh bone. And I think you can very quickly see that this is from an extraordinarily large individual. This individual is from a mine in Namibia. It came out during mining operations from very deep underground, and we have no idea how old it is. Many scientists who have studied this, and it's been studied in several significant studies, have argued that it must be Middle Pleistocene or late Middle Pleistocene, and likely belongs to something like the cobway skull, which is sitting here next to me, one of these very large, robust, what are often called either Homo heidelbergensis or archaic Homo sapiens. But the answer is we don't know. We neither know what it belongs to, except it is a hominid, it's a bipedal femur, and nor how old it is. It could be several thousand years old. It is very fossilized, so it's likely of some archaic age. It could be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in fact, anywhere in the last couple of million years. And so why would someone look at what is clearly a very, very large hominid and say that it's not from a very large individual? Well, the first question we have to ask is this individual actually large? Either for a modern human or for an archaic human or ancient human relative. So here are two femora, which are from Cubiphora. These are thought to be Homo erectus femora, and I think you can immediately see when I put them together in scale, this is the proximal femur, so that's the femoral head there, that the Berg-Aucos femur is large. It's extraordinarily large. It's actually more than twice the size of this one. And interestingly, in both length and in scale, this is only slightly smaller than a modern human. The femoral head is a little bit smaller than would be expected for a femur of this particular length. That's consistent. Here's another one from the site, and you can see the size. This is a very, very big individual. So when you do the statistics on the Berg-Aucos femur, and other scientists have done that and support this, it almost universally comes out at the most extreme range of human variation. In fact, it exceeds by far and away most populations that are studied. Sometimes you get a very large individual that just touches on it in almost any measurement, and exceeds almost every archaic hominid that has ever been measured. So the measurements stand up for this being an extraordinarily large individual. So why would some scientists say that I was overestimating its stature and its body weight? First, we must explore how paleoanthropologists can reconstruct femoral length and then stature from fragmentary bones. One way of doing this is to look at joint size and its relationship to the length of a long bone. So in modern humans, the femoral head and neck area, its size relates to how long a living human bones would be. And so we can measure that, and then we can statistically calculate how long a femur would be. And the length of the femur relates directly to stature. If we applied those modern human statistics to Berg-Alkos, then that individual is very, very tall, approaching 7 feet in height once we extrapolate femoral length to ultimate stature. However, there is a species that we have a good record of that doesn't follow the human pattern, and that's Neanderthals. Neanderthals have very large joints relative to the length of their bones. And so if you measured a Neanderthal, you would get a relatively shorter femur by the same measurements. And so a Neanderthal with a femoral head that would approach that of Berg-Alkos would have a much shorter femur ultimately, and thus be shorter in stature than a human with the same measurements. And the only thing that really compares to this are a few archaic Homo sapiens fossils, which are extremely rare in Africa, and we really don't have any femora like this, and we certainly don't have any complete femora like this. So the only thing we can compare it to are Neanderthals. Neanderthals, of course, occupy Europe, parts of Europe, and possibly even parts of Western Asia. And what we see in them is a very interesting morphology. They're short in stature, but they have very robust joints. And you can see that this Neanderthal actually approaches the size of the Berg-Alkos femur, although the Berg-Alkos femur is admittedly larger than it in almost every dimension you measure. And what's interesting about Neanderthals is that they're very short stature. So let me bring back one of those supposed Homo erectus. And you can see that while the joint dimensions are much smaller in the supposed Homo erectus, the length, the femoral length, is much longer relatively to the joint surfaces. This is much more like the human condition. The Neanderthals are much shorter. That's been thought to be a cold weather adaptation, an adaptation to living in those very cold climes of Europe. And so, in the absence of having African comparison fossils to look at, the scientists who've generally looked at the Berg-Alkos femur have argued that it can't be as tall as it would be if you use just the joint size and shaft size to estimate how tall this individual was. Because when you do that, this individual on human standards would approach something like 7 foot on either side of that range with error bars, and something like 90 kilograms lean. And that's very heavy for a lean muscle mass. And so they measure this, they acknowledge that it's incredibly large, and then they apply the Neanderthal model to it and say, but it must not be very long. It must be from a relatively short individual, because that's what's happening in the middle and late middle Pleistocene. But if scientists are correct in understanding the evolutionary adaptive reason behind why Neanderthals have such unusual joint to bone length ratios, and that is in fact due to them living in relatively cold climates, and that being their body plan adaptation, then there's no more reason to apply that plan to the Berg-Alkos femur, which lives in the tropics or subtropics, than there is to apply a human plan. If you apply the human plan, then the Berg-Alkos femur is very tall. If you apply the Neanderthal plan, then it's likely the Berg-Alkos individual was not so tall. Well, let me say this and get right to the nub of this. Yes, I've said this is a large individual. Yes, I said it has the possibility of approaching 7 foot tall and potentially 90 kilograms using human modeling, and all that is factually true. The answer is it that tall? Is that we don't know. We neither know how old this is, nor do we know what species it belongs to. The one thing that I would say, though, is that we should not necessarily just apply European or Asian models to what's going on in Africa. Europe is a very tiny place relative to Africa. And because it can be very cold and can be subject to ice ages, there may also be specialized adaptations, such as the stocky build of Neanderthals, that may be unique to that region and different to what happens in the tropics and subtropics of Africa, where very different evolutionary stressors may take place on hominid body plans. Discoveries like Homo naledi and others have shown us that many different things are going on in Africa, and Africa does not follow necessarily the evolutionary patterns or the drives and stressors that are going on in Europe. They're very different. And so I would argue that the evidence is just as good for this being a very large individual, approaching perhaps 7 foot in height and 90 kilograms, as it is for it being of Neanderthal proportions and somewhat shorter than that. Whatever it is, it's an extraordinarily big individual. Now, why would scientists attack that? Why would they attack what is an obvious, truthful statement? Well, I think part of it comes from, particularly science in North America, or most of the ones who criticize that conclusion, are under constant barrage by creationists. Creationists come to them and are always looking for giants in the past. Now, why would creationists look for giants in the past? Well, that comes from the biblical story of Nephilim, the idea that there were antediluvian giants, pre-flood giants, and that creationists are often looking for evidence of a flood and thus a pre-flood to prove that every word of the Bible is true. And so when they hear someone like me, a scientist, say, oh, there are very large individuals in the past, they interpret it as referring to giants or Nephilim. I think we've all had our inboxes inundated with these fake pictures of archaeologists somewhere excavating giant bodies. Those are all fake news. And I think understandably, colleagues are sensitive to anything that might feed that sort of fake news. Is it a giant? It perhaps could have been a giant amongst its own population. A 7 foot tall individual amongst any population would be very large. However, it would be rather unremarkable in the NBA, as a lock in rugby, or as a tackle in American football. So the answer is that large individuals occur. This is not a giant, though, unless it were a very large pathological giant amongst its population. It's a possibility, but it's one that we can't test without its population. So that's all for this sort of quick answer based on some topical news from the University of the Witwatersrand's Fossil Vault. I'm Lee Berger. You can follow me on Twitter at Lee R. Berger, or like my public Facebook page, Prof. Lee R. Berger. Be safe out there. Keep washing those hands.